All right, we're going to head over to the Zoom cloud where I have my phone as the hotspot using my laptop in my communications camper here. It's a 25-foot camper getting ready for my year of Jubilee and heading out and hitting the road and going to visit some oil communities and energy communities. Joe Sinnott out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, gearing up for a big weekend, big holiday season happening out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Also, we're going to talk about Landman season 2. That's going to be debuting, I guess, premiering. They debuted season 1, premiered be season 2. It's kind of like first annual. You can't have a first annual. You can have a first inaugural, but you can't have a first annual. And one of my pet peeves in life as a former editor of 20 years. Anyway, Joe Sinnott, enough of the preview going on. Plus, we want to talk about the after hours leadership, since Joe Sinnott is an executive coach. He's also a former oil and gas executive, and he's an all-around good guy. How you doing, sir?
Oh, I'm doing great, Jason. And honestly, hearing you talk there, I'd love to spend an hour just talking about your pet peeves. I think that could be a fun conversation.
I do have some pet peeves. There's there's a great comedian. His name is Gary Shandling, and I forget what show he was on at what point, but some politician tried to dismiss him as he was part of a panel, and he just looked at him and he said, I know I'm a comedian in my profession, but when I'm not, I'm just a regular person, and stuff bothers me. He's just kind of like, I know you all just pigeonhole me as a stereotype, but when I'm not that, I am a human being here. And, I kind of feel like that's the oil and gas industry these days, Joe. It's kind of like, sometimes it seems like they're making a comeback a little bit with Landman, but, Greta Thunberg and some of the climate change narrative and energy transition instead of energy balance and energy, all the above, if you will. I'm a big fan of all energy has a purpose. You and me, and we're all energy. So let's go find what that purpose is. But what's going on in your world out in the Marcellus Utica energy sector out there?
Well, if you look at the headlines, I feel like all roads these days here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere lead to AI and data centers, Jason. Yeah, I don't think you can have
Oh,
a
yeah.
conversation of any sort, and especially one regarding energy and natural gas, and not find yourself talking about the I don't want to say infiltration. That doesn't sound too good, but the proliferation, if you will, of data centers that are coming our way here.
It's kind of the new railroad, really. These data centers that are popping up, and it's the one thing that I think is going to happen, and this is where the oil and gas industry should probably perk up, and because there's a lot being thrown at them right now. And I'm not really trying to turn this into a political thing. This is more of a petroleum prognostication, if you will. Nostradamus. We got to figure out a different word to put that in there. Natural gas amus. There we go. And these data centers are going to replace the transmission lines at the end of the day, because we're not going to be able to continue with the transmission lines from 100 years ago. And it's happening in the Midwest right now. In fact, Kansas is happening big time, where they're replacing and putting new transmission lines and fibers and all these different things. That's going to allow people to charge their vehicles at home. And once the charging at vehicles of home happens, that's going to change the internal combustion engine quite a bit. And that's going to have a ripple into the oil and gas world in terms of cars. And my affinity with vehicles is just the personal freedom. And first, every time I get into a car, it's like getting into a first car for the first time, because I don't want to drive my bike. I don't want to take a horse and buggy. I mean, I love cars and internal combustion vehicles, Joe. So I have a totally different perspective for the oil and gas industry. You're a former executive. That's how you made your living. Look at what's behind you. All your photographs are pretty much oil and gas related and petroleum related. So, I guess I'm trying to backdoor into a little bit of different respects and different perspectives that we all have for the oil and gas industry. And Just I'm going to hand the baton off to you a little bit as we kind of reset a little bit, because I realize I'm rambling now. I'm in that rambling stage, so I feel like I should invite you to the conversation.
That's all right. You say rambling, I say, data gathering. This is what I do on a day-to-day basis, Jason, right? I'm a coach. I ask a question, and sometimes the best things that the people I work with can do is to ramble, is to go off on tangents and, uncover, just one or two little gems that come out that, sometimes can, shift the conversation, shift their thinking, allow us to, move forward productively. So it's amazing the power of rambling and tangents sometimes, Jason. And as far as,
It real.
go, go ahead. Feel
No,
free to
go ahead,
continue
go
on.
I have this pet peeve of mine, which I do, because I've been in the media since I was 10 years old. A second of silence is like an hour in my mind. And so with you, it's been great patience for me, because you're trained to do the opposite. You're trained to actually probably count to 10 before you actually respond back, to let everything settle. And that way you don't jump the fence or jump to conclusions. The media, man, the way we were trained is, hey, you only got 60 seconds, use every second while it counts. And so I've woken up with cold sweats in the middle of the night, looking at this production board, because, oh my goodness, we just had a second of dead air, over. Anyway, so go ahead. I just thought I'd disclose one of my pet peeves here, as long as we get ready for the thankful season. Go ahead.
No, and it's funny. And again, just consistent with what I just said, right? You just sharing some insights from your life, your former life, whatever it was, a minute and a half of insights. You mentioned, your assumption that my training is, has helped me hold the silence more. And it's true, right? I'm not hardwired. I don't think any human is hardwired to just, sit there and, count 1, 2, 3 with nobody talking. But again, we know how powerful it is. And when I went through formal coach training, again, building on my prior experiences, my prior life, if you will, which again, I think you're being a little generous, Jason, calling me an executive. But again, the reality is, in my former life, I had to exercise patience. I had to help slow things down, whether I was dealing with, the C-suite, or whether I was dealing with, people on the front lines. One of the tools at my disposal was the ability to shut up, to listen a little bit more, and then come back with a question that, got the other person talking even more, right? That's not how we're hardwired, especially in a go industry like oil and gas, right? We're there to make a decision, move forward, in some cases, tell people what we know or what we think should be done. And there's a time and a place for that. We wouldn't be where we were if people weren't wired that way. But at the same time, we're leaving a lot of value on the table. And I think, to kind of, I don't want to say close the loop. You opened up there was a lot of different loops and a lot of different directions on what you shared at the opening there, Jason, but to at least bring it back to the conversation on data centers. And again, the proliferation of all of this stuff that's going on, all of these conversations, that is the, at least, hey, that's one theme. Actually, it's a theme I'm talking about next week at a conference, which is, how do you slow people down? How do you inject just a little bit of silence when, people say we're in a race, right? We're in this AI race. We got to go. We got to make these decisions. We got to capitalize. We got to beat out our competitors, if not, other countries, China, right? All these things. But think about the power, the benefit. If you could slow down for just a second and think a little bit more clearly than you would otherwise, right? Think a little bit more clearly than your competitors would. Yes, I get you might feel like, and you may very well be in a race, but holding the silence, Jason, asking the right question, getting other people talking so that you can, again, continue collecting your thoughts, that's powerful stuff. So again, what I love about these conversations, Jason, I never know where they're going to go, but, intentionally or not, you hit on a major theme of my coaching, and I think a major theme, if not major tool, that current and future leaders are going to have to embrace if they want to be those conscious leaders that, at least I think, we need here moving forward.
Absolutely organic innovation happening right here in the communication level, because no, we did not plan this, folks. This is a lot of it's from the hip. We have some bullet points, and one of the bullet points, Joe, I just got to here on my digital fax. It used to be a fax machine and a piece of paper, and back in the old days when I would do, because I came from the newspaper industry, but I was a magazine publisher for 20 years. And I would do radio as well because my roommate, he didn't have a budget. And so I got free lunch because we would do this like noontime show from a different restaurant every day. And so because he didn't have because it was radio, he didn't have a budget. I did it for personal branding. I got free lunch. It was, I was in the magazine business, but I, I had a piece of paper which I could crinkle on the microphone. And so I could add a little bit of theater to the mind. Now I got to hold up my phone and say, well, on the digital fax here, it says Joe Sinnott's going to be speaking at an AI conference next week. So you just kind of previewed that a little bit. So a lot of this is serendipitous. We have 3 bullet points. We have 2 more to get to. Landman is one. Another one is after hours talk. But right now we have the AI speaking bullet point we want to get to. So what's this conference you're speaking at? What's the topic? And who's coming? I mean, is it energy? Is it AI? Is it blockchain? What's happening here?
Yeah, the conference, the title is Digitalization and AI and Energy Appalachia. So it's in downtown
Oh,
Pittsburgh, and it's a day and a half, 2-day conference. And as far as the audience, it'll be energy focused, as the title would suggest. Certainly, being here in Appalachia, you're going to have a lot of natural gas connections. And, as far as attendees, it'll be a combination of operators from the upstream, midstream side of things. I would imagine there'll be some folks representing those, data center or data center adjacent entities out there. And certainly there'll be folks from academia. There'll be various technical experts. And then there'll be me, Jason, who I don't think, fits the mold of anybody. Obviously, I'm in energy. I focus on energy. But, as I said a couple minutes ago, my primary focus and what I will focus on in my talk is just what I shared with you. How do you slow things down when you're in a race, especially with, sort of the unique characters, if you will, that you find in the energy industry? As we just said, right? We're not exactly hardwired to kind of take our time and go slow and be patient. That's just not the nature of things. That's not the nature of, most businesses and corporations. So practically speaking, what do you do? What are the tools you can deploy? What are the communication tactics? What are the questions you can ask? And, as always, Jason, we'll make it fun, right? We'll tie it into some current events, some current headlines here that are, somewhat Pittsburgh centric and all certainly energy centric, even though what we're talking about is universal. So, that's my role there. Again, I am not there to compete or pretend that I have some better sense or crystal ball about where things are headed with AI and digitalization as it relates to the energy industry. Certainly, aware. I try to keep up on things, but ultimately my focus is that human element. So, so long as AI, doesn't in the near term, make humanity go extinct, we're still going to have humans there making decisions and communicating and, needing to be as conscious as possible to achieve the best results for, for companies, for industries, for individuals. And, certainly, my focus next week will also be, how do you achieve the best results for our region here in the Pittsburgh, Appalachian area?
this AI drive is interesting from so many different angles. You've got the ethical ethos, you've got the Terminator cybernetics types, you've got, I mentioned the transmission lines and the power companies. The 2 things that really stand out to me, and I'd be curious if anybody's talking about this at the conference. Is it next week in Pittsburgh? Next week?
Yep.
Okay. Is number one, for oil and gas companies specifically, I believe there's going to be the next big market for those companies that can bring natural gas power stations next to the data centers. So it's eliminates any sort of transmission lines or pipelines. It's just adjacent. And then, of course, if you can do the carbon sequestration right underneath instead of piping it out of there, that's going to be the triple crown. So that part of it's very interesting to me. And then the other part is more from my media background, because I was an editor for so long. It's very easy for me to see point of views, different styles of writing, whether something is leading, not leading. And Joe, I got to tell you, I've had a lot of fights with the AI service that I use about the way they frame the narrative with the language behind the oil and gas industry. And I mean, I'm an award-winning magazine journalist editor. Like, not everybody is that. And by the way, that's just my former life. That's like, I was raised on words. And so, I mean, I was a geek kid that got grounded all the time. I wasn't a geek. I was a hellraiser that got grounded, but then I was a geek because I was in my room. So I read all the time. And so, when I look at my background, the average person is not equipped to understand how the AI is structuring a lot of the different language that we're putting out in the world. And I think you're a little more attuned to that because of your background being an executive coach or a coach. That's what you do. That's your, your daily, your business is words. It just happens to be in the energy sector where you're making your living right now. But that can transition into food prep. That can transition into welding, whatever. I mean, you name it. And so those are the two things that I look for. What are you looking for at the AI Energy Conference? I know you're speaking, but personally, kind of what are you paying attention to? Because right now we're, it feels like we're on the 20-yard line, but I think we're probably closer to the 50.
Yeah. So I'll say one thing. I mean, in terms of not so much what I'm looking for, but what I hope to add to the conversation, the actions that I hope attendees take as a result of my talk on day 2 of the conference is to share openly, actually verbalize, articulate what concerns they have about this AI race, right? Everything that's going on now, all the shift that's happening. I want people to feel like they can talk about it. Talk about it with anybody, especially, their peers and especially, those above them. Because I know full well from my day-to-day work as a coach in the energy industry that there is so much that is unsaid because, hey, you know what? There's a time, there's a place to put on our blinders, and we just got to plow forward. And, that's sort of the sense, whether it's true or not. Again, you're not going to find many C-suite folks who are going to admit that they're putting this pressure on their people to just blindly plow forward. But if that's sort of the narrative, if that's the sense that people are getting, well, you're asking for trouble. So my hope, Jason, is that people, even if it's just those one-on-one conversations, before, during, after my talk, say, hey, Joe, you really touched on something there. I have been struggling to articulate this concern that I have with, whatever entity. And, that's, again, that's why I'm there. That's why I'm there to, I don't know, I'd say offset or add a little comic relief or whatever, the more technical business oriented stuff that people are probably, actually, investing their time, energy, and money to show up for. But again, you could talk technology, you can talk business, you could talk numbers, you can talk your projections and, the commercial markets, everything else. But if you can't address the elephants in the room, Jason, you got problems individually and culturally. So, that's what I'm looking for. And then, beyond that, I'll touch quickly on the two things that you mentioned, one being, what do these data centers mean in terms of, transmission and where's the power being generated and where is it being consumed? And again, I can tell you right here in Pennsylvania, there's no mystery that, proximity to power generation is key. There's no mystery. One of the big ones here, about an hour to the east of where I am in Pittsburgh, Homer City Power Plant. That'll be 4.5 gigawatts, replacing, what was on site, an old coal-fired power plant. Well, obviously the data centers are going to be, co-located, right? So you're going to see a lot of that. But again, coming back to what I see, my role, it's very easy to say, well, this is bad for consumers. This is going to destroy transmission lines, but then, strain our existing infrastructure. But at the same time, there's so much opportunity to have this new power generation, right? To think of things not black and white, right? We got an old infrastructure, we got to replace it. No, there's so much potential for innovation and creativity here, Jason, that, if we have leaders who think creatively and it's not just, option A or B, we're going to be in such a better spot. So that's how I view, the reality of locating power generation to power consumption. And then in terms of sort of the more philosophical side of things, how is this all impacting how people think? How is the world of pick your favorite AI tool. How is it impacting our ability to make decisions, use our time? You know, uh, again, talk for hours about that, but it's crucial. It's key. There's going to be an increased need for sort of that almost philosophical thinking, going back to, to the great thinkers of history, right? Plato and Socrates and all these things. It's amazing how all this technology, I think, is going to force a need for better thinkers, bigger thinkers, to actually avoid human beings going extinct potentially. So a lot there, Jason. But in a nutshell, there, 5 minutes or so, that's how I'm viewing all of this, and that's a little bit of what I aim to share next week at that Digitalization and AI and Energy Appalachia Conference in downtown Pittsburgh.
Transitioning into the world of football here from the AI data centers. And we've been doing some different stories. There was a NIL story we did on a former Cody Campbell, former Texas Tech alum who ended up going and playing for the Colts, Indianapolis Colts, and then he really helped turn around their football program through institution building, if you will, because of all the different rules that you can't do this, you can't do that. But hey, you could go ahead and build a barber shop that all the players and all the athletes can use. And hey, look at this state of the art, jacuzzi that also massages your feet while you're in there, whatever, the state of the art type of things. So the world's changing quite a bit, and story out in your neck of the woods with, I'm trying to think if it was one of the D2 schools out there that plays NDSU quite a bit. It escapes me, offensive linemen and that sort of thing. But Joe, you've got a big game coming up this weekend. You've got Notre Dame against Pittsburgh, I believe, is happening. That's kind of a big one for you personally, but also for your community out there. And what's the football world like out in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania? I mean, you have the Steelers, you've got Pittsburgh, but this is the big game. This is the one where, like when Ohio State comes to town, people pay attention, but it also brings other energy companies and alumni and that sort of thing. So what's happening out there?
Well, I mean, you mentioned football in Pittsburgh. I think I at least have to give you a quick update on the Steelers, which is, not super positive after a lackluster loss there. I think, you and I have talked Aaron Rodgers here on the Crude Life in the past, and a few chinks in the armor there for Mr. Rodgers after the last game. Statistically, and I think in terms of his leadership and everything else, things were looking pretty good for him for a while. But after their disappointing loss to the Chargers, a little concern there. So that's the current state of things. In fact, real quick, I heard just this morning listening to the radio, I heard Mike Tomlin quote, somebody asked him, hey, do you have cause for long-term concerns with Aaron Rodgers, or was Sunday night just an anomaly? And in typical Mike Tomlin fashion, he said, Sunday was not an anomaly, but I don't have any long-term concerns. So it was what I saw is a good example of, hey, you know what? We don't have to look at this in some sort of black and white way, right? Both, multiple things can be true at once. That being said, Jason, in terms of the Pitt game, again, I keep wanting to refer to it as Notre Dame game there, showing my bias, but yeah, Notre Dame currently ranked 9th in the college football playoff rankings, coming to town to face a top 25 Pittsburgh Panthers team. College game day is setting up shop here as we speak outside of Acrisure Stadium. So noon kickoff on Saturday, big game for both teams. You could argue for maybe somewhat different reasons, but all focused on their joint hopes of making the college football playoff. Selfishly, again, got 30 tickets I purchased there, and different entities coming into town, friends and family. So we'll have a nice tailgate, and knock on wood, the weather's looking good too, which, obviously beyond your control, but that'd be a nice thing to sprinkle in there. So, that's my view on things. And in terms of, what football does, bringing people together, yeah, it's a good excuse, right? It's a good excuse for people to come to town to, show off themselves, if you will. There'll be no shortage of celebrities there, especially when you throw college game day in the mix. So we'll be curious who shows up there. But, in terms of energy, there's definitely an increased figurative energy when you've got teams playing well, right? Two teams on on a 7 and 5 game winning streak there for Notre Dame and Pittsburgh, respectively, Jason. So, yeah, very excited for those attending the that conference there that I'll be speaking at. Don't worry, I'll preserve some amount of energy there for whatever it is Wednesday morning when I'm speaking.
All right, so I'm not trying to be snarky, or I'm not trying to be I don't know, risque, because I still do adhere to FCC guidelines as much as I can, because ultimately most of these end up on the radio in some format or another, and we don't like to edit. We're lazy. We want to make sure it's just seamless, and plus it's just good manners not to swear. I was raised Catholic, and so when you're spoon-fed fear and guilt your whole life, you just assume you're being watched all the time by the creator above. And so, Joe, when I say the word backdoor bingo, that's why I don't want anybody to get all out of hand here, but the oil and gas industry really should have a backdoor bingo card for these tailgates, because when you think about everything put together, the tailgating experience would not even be remotely possible without the oil and gas industry. And leading a horse to water and dunking their head in there is not working. So the public is not accepting the facts. They want the feelings, they want the games, they want the fun. And so if people had a bingo card and all that was on there was things that were made out of petroleum products, but you didn't say that, right? So, Joe, when I'm thinking of a bingo card out at tailgating, think of the tents. They're not canvas. They're made out of nylon pretty much. I mean, anything, the vehicles that they come in, the pull behinds, the fact that people are grilling. Most people are probably using propane. Yeah, you got some charcoal, but not everybody. I mean, can you imagine if everybody was using wood at these tailgates and bringing? I mean, where would the horses go to the bathroom? And now when we're horse and buggies, and now when we're taking a look at some of the EV vehicles, that's going to completely change the entire dynamic of the entire tailgating experience. I'm not trying to get existential here. I'm not trying to be natural gas Thomas. And I'm not trying to be a petroleum prognosticator. Got the rule of three there. But Joe, think about it. The backdoor bingo card. What's on your bingo card? When you go to one of these tailgating events, the petroleum industry is being represented in about every single booth out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just going through my mind the very long list of things that need to be procured for the tailgate, and the things that need to be thrown into our fossil fuel powered vehicle there to drive on down to our spot there. And you're right, Jason. I mean, I don't know what else to say other than it is tough to imagine a tailgate or sort of any part of modern existence without oil and gas. But I guess the flip side to that, though, Jason, and maybe it's not a flip side, is from a communication standpoint, trust me, I can rattle off. I can advocate till the cows come home, if you will, when it comes to oil and natural gas and how it impacts our lives and how it powers our lives and all of those things. But the key for our industry is, can you move beyond those talking points, right? Because somebody can step through and say, yeah, but, do we really need to be doing that? Are we just addicted to these various things? Is it necessary to have all of these, fossil fuel powered produced items? And again, without, having to say yes or no, part of my job is to prepare people for that next level argument, right? You could fill up your bingo card and still have somebody who is against your industry will say, well, so what? Is it worth it? It's easy to kind of flippantly say, all right, just imagine how much dirtier the parking lots would be if this was all horses and buggies. But, are individuals in the industry prepared to say unequivocally that oil and natural gas produces a net positive benefit for humanity? Because that's the bottom line, right, Jason? People will get lost. You fill up a bingo card, there's so many people who are inundated with all of these facts and these talking points and everything else, and they sound like arguments, and it almost can sound like an excuse, right? But it's that leader who can boil things down and say, look, forget the bingo cards. At the end of the day, I firmly believe, and I think there's an objective argument, that human beings are better off because of oil and gas. That's what you need to keep coming back to, not the solo cups and the plastic tables and the I don't know. I'm thinking about I got to test out, make sure the Keurig will be powered. I promise coffee for people there. Can I plug the Keurig into my vehicle there, not blow a fuse or whatever? But again, ultimately, all roads lead back to fossil fuels. It's easy to get again back into those weeds, but the real story is maybe on the flip side of that. What'd you call it? Backdoor bingo card. It's, hey, oil and gas has provided a net positive benefit to humanity, period.
So when I'm looking at some of the other things that are happening here, and I'm looking at the clock and kind of where we're at, and the bingo card, and lead a horse to water, but they're not really connecting much on that. It's the quality of life and some of the other aspects that I do think is lost on people. And so that part is going to be rather interesting to see how it changes. And that's why I bring up the bingo card, because I do think that it's the experience that people are engaging with and they're connecting with. And it's a lot like when, and I mentioned this before, when the grocery store replaced the farmer. You had people that had no problem protesting against, animal cruelty and all these different things. And then they'll go to the grocery store and pick up ground beef and pick up, all these different things. And so to me, that's the same. And so for the oil and gas leadership, that's where they need to step back and say, okay, what isn't working for us? And the name escapes me. I believe it's Kimmeridge is the name of this kind of this anti-fossil fuel political activist funding group. And there was another one with Exxon that I did a story on a couple years ago. And so it kind of, the name escapes me, the one proxy type of a thing. But the story is the same here, Joe, which is that there's a younger generation that's having a big impact on the older generation. And what I mean by that is that there's a primarily large percentage of people over the age of 60 that are reliant on the oil and gas industry to keep them alive, whether it's machines, whether it's replacement hearts, whether it's titanium down in the knees. I can tell you that when I went through my cancer battle and had to have 2 major surgeries in less than 30 days and went 18 days without food and water, 90% of the things keeping me alive was petroleum products. But they were just the vehicle that gave me the things that I needed, whether it was delivering it there, whether it was the bag holding it, whether it was the power. And when you go to any city USA or the world, 60% of your grid is emergency services, which includes hospitals, police, fire, etc. So it's an interesting communication gap that's happening, because the younger generation is bringing in this ideology, this idealistic, platitudes type of a thing. And it's all experience-based fun. It's all experience-based, whatever, kumbaya, if you will. It's
Mhm.
and it's great. It's fine. No problem. That's great to have a goal to get there. But I don't know, Joe. There just seems to be something missing where the oil and gas industry leadership is having a real difficult time connecting with the generation, to where, like I said, Exxon had this to where it started at Thanksgiving with some kids at one of the owner's table. And he was feeling this guilt coming at him through the Thanksgiving Day table. And now I'm seeing out in your neck of the woods, this Kimmeridge group is starting to create some real issues out there too. And a lot of it's feelings over fact. And I get it, whether we want to go with Barabbas and Jesus Christ, or, there's stories, all kinds of, sorry, that was a Bible verse and parable for those out there that are wondering where that Barabbas and Jesus Christ reference came from. It's a story of how mass people react and how they choose and how they behave. And so it cycles back and forth. And so I'm saying that there's enough evidence for the oil and gas leadership to take a step back and say, okay, we need to connect differently here. So I'm going to take a step back because I know you're speaking tomorrow at a group that is primarily a lot of younger people too. So anyway, go ahead and speak now because there's like 10 questions in there. So
10 questions, but one theme that I heard listening to you, Jason, and that is a major problem that I see in the energy industry and again, in all human beings, myself quite often, and that is an inability to hone in on one key point, one key takeaway, one key question that you're trying to answer. And so, as I said previously, when it comes to oil and gas, I think the ultimate question for humanity is, are we better off as a species because of oil and gas? And what happens is, and I'll generalize, and I'll generalize and I'll point the finger at engineers here, as an engineer, a former engineer, depending on how you look at it. We like to get into the weeds. We like our data. We like to really hunt and argue over little things, all this minutia. But at the end of the day, we lose sight of that, that one final question. And so I think, from an oil and gas standpoint, we spend a lot of time bickering on the pros and the cons and the trade-offs and the costs and everything else. And we're playing defense on, here's the impact on, the community and the environment, everything else, but yeah, here's all the positive and everything else. And it gets this big complicated thing instead of pausing periodically and saying, all right, net, are we better off? And it's the same thing, when you get to activist investors like Kimmeridge. So Kimmeridge, again, I don't think they're anti-oil and gas, but, they're pro-making money. So, the reason you referenced, the connection here to Pennsylvania is several years ago, we had a company here, Cabot, and there was another company, Cimarex, and they decided to merge. But Cabot was, natural gas, Cimarex more on the, the liquid side, the oil side. And so they merged, they formed this entity, obviously all the synergies and everything else that were going to come with diversification, all that type of stuff. And 4 years later, or whatever it is, an investor, Kimmeridge, is saying, hey, we're not seeing the results. We're not seeing what it is that you promised. And they, I think a week or so ago, they're pushing for a change. They're pushing for at least, some changes to the board there. And without getting into the details, their take is this was not a net positive transaction from an investor standpoint, and we want to see change. And obviously there'll be an ongoing, battle, I'm sure, back and forth and all the details and everything else. But at the end of the day, as you watch that, Jason, it should come down to, one question. Are investors better off than they would have been if those two companies didn't combine to form Coterra? And, yeah, they would all both say, oh, well, that's what we're working towards, Joe. We got to get the data to get there. But I'm telling you, Jason, people don't stop. It's just like politics, right? You get into politics and this is my side, this is your side, back and forth, all this battle. But, what's the one question that cuts through so much, right? Popularized, I think, by Reagan. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Is there any better question than that? All the other bickering, you can cut through that. You can almost set aside the data sometimes and just answer with your gut and say, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. But that does not happen on a daily basis because it's more fun sometimes to argue about the details and the minutia. It's easier to argue in the minutia instead of, trying to address that big question. And quite frankly, there's plenty of entities out there who are happy having people get into the weeds and spend all this time, energy, money on the minutia, on the details, coming up with all of these various trains of arguments without saying, look, are we better off or not? That's what we need to be answering. And so, again, I'll get off my soapbox there, Jason, but I guess, one other thing, connecting it to what you referenced there, I about once a month or so, I'll moderate a live tech talk, Society of Petroleum Engineers, SPE. They put on these tech talks where company will come on, they'll talk about some new technology. And, I see part of my role in that, to not just try to extract the detail that our, very technical audience there enjoys, but to also make sure that the technical experts that are coming on can boil it down to, that one key takeaway, that one thing that you want your audience to remember, to ask themselves, to share with others, because it's so easy, especially for an industry, again, that has a lot of engineers, a lot of technically minded folks. It's so easy to just feel like, you know what? I shared all these details. I shared the full bingo card, if you will, of everything that oil and gas does. I can rest on my laurels now because clearly this data is overwhelming and points to a clear answer when, guess what? Humans, especially in 2025, reduced attention spans, you can't assume that that pile of data and facts is really going to stick for your audience. So that's how I view it, Jason, from the lens of a coach, of someone who spends most of his time working with individuals on communication and who sees, unfortunately, so many messages getting lost.
Landman 2 is going to be hitting the Paramount Plus streaming this Sunday, coming up here in less than a week. And this is kind of a big deal for the industry. And I don't quite know if they're understanding how big of a deal this is. And it didn't really register until I was doing my last interview with Warren Martin, and we were just doing a quick preview. And when you take a look at the last time that the oil and gas industry has had this type of representation, and I believe it's going to be more of a positive than negative, because when you look at what weeds did for weed, it was positive. When you look at what Breaking Bad did for meth, it was actually positive, to where the state of South Dakota did a campaign that said, meth, we're on it. I mean, for crying out loud. So, and that didn't backfire as bad as they should have, but it was taken in a comedic way. So when I take a look at when things go mainstream and they kind of really go head on with it, with the good and the bad, and they're exaggerating both sides, but it's a way to connect at least. I do think it's going to be a positive for the industry. So with that being said, Billy Bob Thornton, Demi Moore, Andy Garcia, Sam Elliott. Joe, these are A-list actors, and some of the younger ones are some up-and-comers that have been on some other programs, so there's some connection there. There's some real good humor, especially with the attorney that's just like completely out of place in that house of malcontent, if you will, that just seems like there's just an HR nightmare, and he shouldn't be witness to any of that stuff that's going on. And, he's just trying to eat his breakfast, for crying out loud. So you have some real grounding, and then you've got some drama, but my point is this, Joe, is that these actors, I mean, Demi Moore, she shaved her head, for crying out loud. She's bringing in a level of empowering women to this audience. Okay. You got Sam Elliott. My radio mentor said it best. Boy, women's knees buckle when he speaks. Yeah, that's about dead on. Sam Elliott speaks and their knees buckle, man. So when I take a look at who they're bringing in, and Billy Bob, one of the best in the business, serious, badass. Yeah, that's right. I said it, radio. I said it. Sorry, London. And so when we take a look at this, what's your thoughts on the new series of Landman? Because at the end of the day, Joe, it is going to connect the cartel to the oil and gas industry. And the oil and gas industry is very tribal. And quite honestly, they're a little sensitive. I'm not sure if they're going to accept it as well as I hope that they will.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for my take on, again, is this a net positive for the industry, which is, I'd be inconsistent with what I shared with you previously if I didn't ask that question. I think it's unequivocally yes. Having this out there as an opportunity for people to, even just get a glimpse, even if, again, it's not going to be 100% factual or accurate, that doesn't matter. If it's an opportunity to remind people that, look, oil and gas plays, this isn't some dying entity that is, fading away. If anything, it's even more important than it's ever been. And, there's that famous now, I think, 5-minute scene there from early on in season one of Landman, where Billy Bob Thornton, talks about that, talks about our reliance on oil and gas. And so having that out there, Jason, allowing for that conversation to be had, and selfishly for me, having another vehicle to connect leadership themes, communication themes to, something that's current, something that's fresh, that helps drive home these messages better than just some generic conversation about communication or executive presence or decision making, coaching, all of these various things. Just from season one alone, the richness of the characters that you just talked about, the scenes, some of the memorable exchanges there, all of that was just so rich and such a great vehicle for me to help people in our industry, which I did through various workshops that are focused on the Paramount Plus series Landman, and again bringing in the you could argue the executive presence of somebody like Tommy Norris, played by Billy Bob Thornton, bringing in the sort of the steadiness, almost the coaching approach, the listening, the silence, if you will, that his son brought to the table. Obviously the different tools that the lawyers, each of the two main lawyers, brought. Obviously very, sort of complementary, very different approaches. All of those things tie very nicely to the day-to-day things that every individual, regardless of your role, you certainly don't have to be a landman to appreciate all of those lessons, Jason. So all that to say, when you have something like this, whether it's a cultural phenomenon, I don't know that Landman is in that category, but when there's something, universal, when there's something in the headlines that a critical mass of people are at least somewhat familiar with, again, I'll speak from my own experience. It makes my job easier to find those connections, to reinforce these things that are crucial so that they don't just, feel like they're coming from left field, or there's this high level, arm wavy, soft skill type of stuff that, can be in one ear and out the other. So that's my take on it, Jason. Either way, whether what I just shared is, just a bunch of malarkey, if you will, I'm looking forward to the premiere of season 2. I'm looking forward to, again, another opportunity to weave in the characters, including a new character there, as you referenced there, Sam, and seeing how that can reinforce the leadership principles among the oil and gas industry that I spend my days working with.
Malarkey is a word that I miss and should be infused more into my daily rhetoric. That's for sure. The one thing I do think that Landman, if I was an oil and gas professional, which some say I am, what I would take from Landman, in all honesty, if, like, let's say that I was part of, one of these petroleum associations or part of this group that you're going to tomorrow, or because there are people who actually get paid to promote the industry, Joe. Like, it's not just you and me who are doing it out of the goodness of our heart. There's actually people who are specifically paid to promote the industry. So if I were someone like that, what I would take from Landman is a good opportunity to educate the rest of the industry that this is where it's at, guys, that now you have something to talk about when you're at the tailgating events, when you're at the ball games, when you're at these other things. And guess what? They're giving you little Easter eggs where you can grab a hold of the conversation. For example, they use the wrong wrench. Show your experience and say, you know what? What's great about the show is, for us, it's a little bit more of a comedy, but it's good too, because, they'll have the wrong wrench. So you can infuse your expertise, which makes you now in charge of the conversation, and then switch it over to, but they have to dramatize it like when the guy's walking on top of the pipes. Yeah, OSHA would never allow that. The foreman would never allow that, but the directors would, because the guy ended up underneath a bunch, and so they need some drama that's involved there. So it gives the professional a great opportunity to show how the media is dramatizing it through a lot of what Sheridan is portraying through Landman. That's what my takeaway was, Joe, was that it gives the oil and gas industry the ability to grab something that is in pop culture. And granted, I'm with you. It's not one of the top 10, but it can be, and it would be to the industry, because guess what? When you're at Thanksgiving and a bunch of kids are talking about Greta Thunberg, well, that's not top 10 either, but it is in that conversation. And
Mhm.
so that's when you got to fold in some of these other things. And hey, if most people still connect with Avatar and Lord of the Rings and other things, they go to movies and shows when they want to connect with things they don't understand. And so that's why I think Landman is so important. It has actors that have stamped it, all the way from Demi Moore to Sam Elliott to some of the younger people they're bringing in. And you've even got um, uh, Paramount as well. The guy from Yellowstone, Taylor Sheridan, right? Taylor, not
Mhm.
Tyler, Sheridan, and he's, he's definitely top notch too. So this is an opportunity, is what I'm saying. Oil and gas professionals, this is the opportunity that you've been waiting for the past decade to happen. Strike while the iron is hot. So sorry, didn't. I'll get down off my soapbox now. So comment, Joe Sinnott.
Your soapbox is perfect, Jason. You know that as you were talking, and then you used the word there at the end a couple times. It's opportunity, and I'll bring it back to the day to day, right? How many people do you encounter who, again, can only look at things black and white? And there's some error, something wrong, and it's like I'm going to dismiss all of Landman because, again, whether it's the wrench or any number of sort of factual errors. Say, well, so what? So what? How do you actually use that to your benefit? How do you use that to have a conversation that you wouldn't otherwise have if, they did a little bit more diligence and, they didn't do something that would never happen in the field. Like again, it can sound like sort of a hokey, silver lining, positive mindset, whatever. But guess what? If you can sort of rewire yourself, rewire your brain to say what I like about that, or hey, because of that error, because of that mistake, because something went wrong. And again, we're moving beyond the show, right? In business, hey, because of that disruption, now we have an opportunity to do something that we wouldn't otherwise have. And again, it could be dismissed as cliche, which is why I love opportunities like Landman. And I love the opportunity when somebody starts bad mouthing something like a show and say, it's a bunch of crap or whatever. Like, say, great, that allows me to have a conversation about leadership and communication and decision making, and not looking at things always as black and white that I wouldn't otherwise have. So again, Jason, you hit the nail on the head. Opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. I think that's how our industry should view Landman. And so for anybody listening who's there and just inclined to cast stones and say how wrong it is, I challenge you to say, all right, well, what do you like about this? How is this an opportunity for you selfishly to do something, to say something that you wouldn't otherwise do or say?
There's a movie out called Sarah's Oil as well that I think the industry should probably check out. It's about a young African American girl in Oklahoma who gets some mineral rights, and she ends up basically working the system, working the supply chain to get it done back in the early 1900s. And it's a faith-based movie from my understanding, and so it's going to have a female point of view, a minority African American point of view, and then also a old school kind of that rags to riches, rigs to riches type of a storyline to it. So ironically, that one actually might do more positive for the industry than Landman, but in kind of a different way. So it's called Sarah's Oil, folks, if you want to check that out as well. Joe, I bring up pop culture because, in my mind, it's basically a 24/7 Simpsons show going on. And, I was raised on The Simpsons and Cheers and Nick at Night and, that sort of thing. So, I'm MTV generation, right? So, but our cartoons had morals, man. We had He-Man that came on the end and said, hey, Skeletor didn't share. That's why he's evil. If you share, you can be a hero. It gave very black and white morals for us. And so we understood kind of some of those different things. One of the reasons, too, that the founding fathers put in there, the word God was not because of Christianity, was that they saw that anyone who worshipped, whether it be a Jewish God or a Christian God or even a Muslim God or a Buddhist God, essentially they kind of had the same plot morals when it came to ethics. And so when you're out in society, it's good to know where somebody draws their ethics from. And as we kind of get away from a lot of the different churches and some of the different morals as we talk, there's this confusion of ethics that are going on, and that's why I go to pop culture, because what used to be a shared value system of kind of churches and ethos of an ethics system, that's kind of gone away in the digital world and been replaced a lot by pop culture. Joe, how do you talk to people when it comes to some of these different things? This is the adult after hours conversation here, because the Kimmeridge and the Exxon proxy and some of the angst that has come up through the oil and gas industry is that disconnect where you don't know how to connect with people anymore. And like I said, when I grew up, it was the value system that the 10 commandments, if you will, heck, 5 commandments, if we want to boil it down. And that was enough for me to go out and be okay with society. That was enough. But now I'm in a camper, man. I'm ready to go. If I had a boat, I could go from port to port, but instead I'm landlocked. So I got to go from, community to community. What would you suggest to an executive out there trying to talk to someone who's really searching for a way to connect on the good their industry is doing? Like I said, I use pop culture, and it doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. What do you recommend? Did I make any sense at all?
Plenty of sense there, Jason. Plenty of sense. And I'll say this, and this is not limited to executives at all. Every individual out there has an opportunity to ask their stakeholders, right? Whether it's family stakeholders, business stakeholders, investors, customers, bosses, direct reports, whatever. Everyone out there has the opportunity to say, all right, well, what are your commandments, if you will, right, Jason? You said, 5 commandments can be enough, forget the 10. Interestingly enough, that's kind of that sweet spot. 4 or 5, call them values, call them pillars, whatever you want to call them. You have the opportunity to ask your audience, hey, what are those? It doesn't have to be a single word. It could be a phrase or whatever, but ultimately, like, what is your filter? And it's amazing, what you'll find is, people can ultimately get there, but so few people really carry with them sort of that short list. Again, they can talk for an hour about, what's important, or they might think they have some quick hits, but ultimately, have they actually thought about an answer to what are those 4 or 5 pillars that drive you, that you can use as a filter in every situation, every decision, whether it's a business related decision, maybe you're looking for a new job, whether it's a decision on whether to move, sell your house, go somewhere else, move to a new city, make a decision on your health, on your well-being, who to marry, all those type of different things, Jason. It's amazing how powerful that is if you as an individual, especially in a leadership position, if you have that information. And so much of my time, Jason, is spent with individuals, especially when there's a bit of conflict, saying, all right, what is the ideal for the other person? What would have them jumping up and down for joy, saying, holy cow, like this is great. Yeah, this excites me. But instead, and again, this is a recurring theme, that you and I have talked about today. Instead, we find ourselves kind of moving very quickly from the high level end goal, ultimate outcome, and then we shift into the weeds there, and that's so time consuming and energy draining, and you find yourself off in another direction. So maybe that's not the answer you were looking for, or maybe I answered a different question, Jason, but it all comes down to asking the other party, right? Asking Kimmeridge, and I am sure that, Coterra will do just that, right? But it's like, I mean, at the end of the day, what are you looking for? I know what you put in your letter to us and everything else, but, let's be clear here. What wasn't clear from your letter? What is it that you're looking for? What would your ideal outcome be? Whether or not we're going to be on board with that. Get those answers first before you start engaging in battles and warfare. That step is skipped far too much in so many different areas, Jason, and which is why, again, I think I've repeated myself probably 4 times in the last 2 minutes, but it's because it is that important.
Yeah, and the way that I heard it was that, if you're the Exxon proxy who got it from basically his family at Thanksgiving, um, go around the room and find out what everyone's thankful for. Take notes and incorporate that into your conversation when you're explaining why the industry should be grateful for the oil and gas industry. And like I've told people before that I grew up in the agriculture industry, so as a kid, while we were in the other room playing, speed and different shoots and ladders and, Clue and different board games, we could hear the parents talking about how the grocery store was replacing the farmer. We could hear how the government was coming in and telling farmers that they couldn't plant there and had to plant this crop, or basically they were on their own or going to be didn't have crop insurance or whatever the manufactured consent of the day was. And so I'm a little bit sensitive to it. And a lot of that's happening right now. And so when we talk about this, Joe, it's more of just kind of a experiential from some standpoint, but it's also a little bit of advice. There's some advice there because we are getting into the holiday times, and the oil and gas industry specifically is a polarizing topic for a lot of people. And if you can, as an industry professional, de-escalate that within your own group, your own circle, that's when it's going to become very reciprocal. That's when it's going to become a lot more acceptable and acceptance. And that's when people are going to notice that, oh, geez, we have, Landman and Sarah's Oil. And now look at this. We got another movie that's coming out that's positive, or this event that's hosted by this professional group and that sort of thing. So I see it as positive momentum. Folks, take the advice as you want, or leave some comments and tell us to get bent or whatever the case is. But I think I'm going to put together a bingo card, Joe. I like that idea of the tailgate bingo card, because people are always looking for fun things to do. Do you have a favorite tailgating game that you like to play? Because there's all kinds of them now. You have the different rings and the different balls and the different surfboards and all kinds of different things. Do you have one that stands out that you like to play?
No, I'm pretty boring in that regard, Jason. And we'll be in some of it. If you have grass nearby, you have obviously a couple more options. But we'll be in an asphalt parking lot, so cornhole will be the game du jour on Saturday morning before the Notre Dame Pitt game.
Do you guys play the testicle toss or whatever that's called, the different ladder? The two golf balls with the string, and yeah, I don't know what it's called. This is the true story. I'm not kidding you. We had a guy that made these games like 25 years ago, before they were even known, and he'd just show up at bonfires and keg parties. And we called it testicle toss. We didn't know what the actual name was, and so I don't actually know what the real ladder ball. I don't know.
Well, yeah, up until 20 seconds ago, when clearly I am now going to be calling it testicle toss for the rest of my life. But up until then, I would have called it ladder golf, Jason. But
is that what? Okay, ladder golf. Because when I go by at the stores, it's just for a quick second. I'm like, what's that? Testicle toss is called ladder? What? And so I started thinking in my head, going, yeah, I don't think it's called testicle toss out in the main world. That must be our group's original. Okay, that sounds good. But then after you hear it, you're like, well, I'm not going to call it by its real name. It's much more fun calling it the T squared and that sort of thing. So anyway, well, we'll end on that note, Joe. Just a quick recap. You're speaking tomorrow and then next week, is that right?
Yeah, tomorrow's a virtual event, SP Tech Talk, and then next week, November 17th and 18th, downtown Pittsburgh at the Digitalization and AI in Energy Appalachia Conference.
Of course, you can always check them out at whittingpartners.com for the Energy Detox podcast as well. And folks, we'll catch you on the flip side. Joe, we'll catch you in a few weeks.
Thank you very much, Jason.